One of the hallmarks of those of us in ministry as laity and clergy is that we are scholar practitioners. We must have a wide array of technical skills. The copier is dead, let's figure it out. I'm the fundraiser for this place, let's go. I need to be able to motivate or fire diverse volunteers, no problem. That's called a normal Tuesday. And we also have to be able to move across diversity in a lot of visible and invisible ways. There's a researcher, Matt Blum. He works at the University of Notre Dame, and his wife is a United Methodist elder. He has devoted his life and research to learning more about those of us who are in emotionally challenging fields and how we find fulfillment and flourish. Some of you who may have been working with your credentialing bodies and your boards of ministry may have heard of him. He and his team are working on what it means to flourish in one's vocation, and he researches medical professionals, social workers, and clergy. Clergy are outliers. He has discovered that clergy are the people who have to code switch multiple times a day because of the wide variety of tasks, environments, and relationships we are in with our parishioners and our ministry settings and our partners. Code switching is the ability to speak or to be with or interact or understand or be welcomed by someone or groups who are different than you. It is a skill and an identity, and sometimes it can be considered a strategy. I served at Methodist Theological School in Ohio for over 10 years. I began in admissions, I moved into enrollment management, and eventually added fundraising and alumni relations and other administrative work, and served as VP of Institutional Advancement. It was really hopeful to work in a place where there were new and current students of all ages who were trying on different roles and claiming new identities. While at MTSO, I served on the board of Ordained Ministry and served as the chair of the BOOM for about a year and a half until I ended up working at the conference office in my current role and stepped down as chair to make sure there was no conflict of interest. And again, that was hard and hopeful work instead of coming from a school direction, coming from a conference direction, as we met incoming clergy who were learning new codes and living into this identity and ministry of working across difference. I don't know about you, but I was a teenager when I discerned a call to ministry, and at that time I felt called to be a pastor in a church as my identity and role. But even as I was mulling over my growing discernment and hearing the guidance of the Holy Spirit, I was simultaneously wondering whether I was a fraud. There were so many people who manipulated power, authority, and voice to get what they wanted. How could I be authentic in ministry and not overstep bounds? Was I even going into ministry for the right reasons? In college, I began serving as an associate pastor in my local church and continued through the rest of college and seminary. And it was good practice because I was trying on the role of minister and seeing how it felt to lead and serve a church. But as a young woman, I remember thinking about how I would need to present myself in the pulpit in order to be heard. Using today's language, I was trying to figure out if I would have to compromise my own identity and lose parts of who I was as I learned how to speak in different code in order to have power and authority in the pulpit. I remember thinking about who I was and how that affected my role as minister. How much of my own call to ministry was rooted in being complicit in traditional standards of heteronormative patriarchy. In other words, how much did I benefit by being married to a man at a very young age as I was going through credentialing and then serving in ministry? How much did I benefit from looking young at the time? What did it mean to be a woman in ministry? And what did it mean to be a multiracial, a mixed-race woman in ministry? I'm 37 now. So in the past 18 years, I have served in a church, served at a theological school, and now I'm in a conference office serving in diversity and inclusion, and I'm an ordained deacon. At this point in my life, I am wondering now how much of my early discernment and call was rooted in a fear of how much of myself I would have to give up in order to be heard. Just because we manage situations and systems dealing with gender specifically doesn't mean that the problems are fixed in our own churches, our organizations, and our lay and clergy leadership. Sometimes our nearly magical skill set of code switching can cover up things that need to be dealt with. So let's talk about gender. I do want to name that I am not minimizing race. This is a conversation primarily about gender, but we must name that all of this is intersectional, and as a multiracial woman, it's all connected for me, and we all carry multiple identities. But for the moment, let's talk a bit about gender. Hannah Shanks is here, and yesterday she talked about her 2018 book called This Is My Body. And I have the temporary tattoo. I've never had a tattoo, and so like to have this and to look down, it is very profound to say, this is my body. But the topic of dual consciousness comes up in her book, and that is a topic in many fields as well, especially around race and gender. I love how in her book, Hannah talks about what it meant to realize that she was suddenly being treated differently as a female when she moved from being perceived as a child to being perceived as a teenager. Similarly, people of color can have a dual consciousness in certain settings, and as I have moved into and out of ministry settings, I have been so darn aware of how my gender has affected my work, and as a multiracial woman, this has shaped my ministry all my life. In the United Methodist Church, about 1 in 4 clergy are female. That's all. A few months ago, our conference, I'm in West Ohio, our conference offered a clergy day apart. So it was an opportunity for all of our clergy to gather for teaching, worship, Sabbath, and fellowship. It was not mandatory, but all were encouraged to come. It was great. And when I attended, I was fulfilled, and it was so good to see friends that I really only saw in person at annual conference and at meetings. So because I am not fun at parties, our table conversations ended up on gender and ministry. So I shared with them the statistics that I just shared because that's what I think about and talk about. And that, like, lead from your strengths. And then, but a good friend looked around the room. There were probably about 200 people in the room. And he looked at all the clergy gathered and he said, when you look around the room at the people who chose to come, you would never know that we have such a gender imbalance in leadership. Just because we manage something, work around, and keep moving forward doesn't make it okay. Sometimes we can look around, we can make a quick assessment, and we assume that there's no problem. I think that today we can be honest about how far we've come in terms of gender and leadership in the United Methodist Church, and we can also drill down and name that while some situations look good, we still have a lot of work to do. I recognize that UMC Lead is a self-selected group for even as our talks will be shared online with the public. So we're talking to each other and then also talking to the world. So I call you here, I call myself, and I call our colleagues beyond this particular gathering today to step into today's need. It is our time to claim what it means to flourish in ministry as women and men in leadership, lay and clergy. But before we launch into this work, and this is not new work, just adding to the conversation, before we launch into this work, let's remind ourselves about the reality of God. God is non-binary. If you think about the Trinity has to have a dual or triple consciousness. Perhaps our abilities to code switch and the realities that we all have multiple identities is a reflection of the image of God. And God is not limited by gender or sexuality. Perhaps God is not a dual or triple consciousness, but an infinite consciousness. Furthermore, every time Jesus interacted with someone, he code switched. He used different language, he used different tone, different storytelling techniques, different settings, different physical movements, and more, depending on who he was with. Perhaps our odd and wondrous skill set as lay and clergy ministry leaders is more Christ-like than we give ourselves credit for. So as we think about how many different ways Jesus interacted with people, I'd like to share a story about ministry and my own code switching. Last month, on the Sunday before Christmas, a car ran into our sanctuary 15 minutes into worship. A member in her 90s was driving, and we aren't sure what happened. All we know is that right as the first hymn was beginning, she drove into like a doorway of the church, through the narthex, and then into the sanctuary, hitting the back row of pews. Now, amazingly enough, while 6 people other than the driver went to the hospital after the accident, they were all discharged that afternoon with nothing more than superficial injuries from glass and debris. And even the driver, she's in her 90s, she's doing all right. She's in a nursing home going through rehab. And I will mention that she came in like kind of the side and the back of the sanctuary. And there's a picture of like a car in the sanctuary, and then on the screen is "Come Thou Long Expected Jesus." Like, But even though we had higher than normal attendance that Sunday because the choir was going to present their Christmas cantata, so we had extra guests and extended family in the worship that day, no one was sitting in the pews, which was not normal. And I guess because she was running late, no one was in the narthex. I was not on duty that Sunday, and that I was not assisting with worship that day. Now, those of you who have roles in local churches, you know that you're never not on duty, but I was not assisting with worship that day, so I had different hats on. I am a deacon, and my primary appointment is beyond the local church. So my involvement in my secondary appointment at the church is limited and depends on the season and my work obligations. So I was holding my 2-year-old, sitting by my in-laws because my husband is a music director and they wanted to come and hear the cantata when this happened. And we were all fine, just shaken. So in the days afterward, there were news articles, there was a little video online, a very nice video online from the local TV station, and a lot of public Facebook chatter. And when colleagues and friends have been asking me about the accident, I am finding myself at a loss for words. I'm usually pretty good at giving a general, polite answer about all sorts of public events, but I have had no words. I am aware that this could have been so much worse. But even though it could have been so much worse, I was still sitting in church on a Sunday, holding my child when a car drove into the worship space a couple pews behind me. So there are a lot of codes that I am living into right now. Just because we may manage something, work around it, and keep moving forward doesn't make it okay. Sometimes when we manage things, we minimize the reality of a situation that is just wrong. So as you think about the different codes that you would use in a crisis situation and the different codes that you currently live into in your ministry leadership, let's take a moment to think through how we can make a difference in our current United Methodist Church in terms of gender and leadership as men and women and as a community of leaders. For women of any sexual orientation and for those who are perceived as female, here are some thoughts. First, as you are in ministry settings, think about whether an interaction is interpersonal or inter-role. Women leaders, this is a quote from Mariko Silver. She is the president of Bennington College in Vermont, and she said that women leaders are more expected to walk a tightrope between interpersonal and inter-role. Women leaders are expected to be both kind and authoritative, both analytic and welcoming, both warm, including being open to any question no matter how off-putting, and clearly commanding. People in our ministry settings are demanding us to present our leadership in a dual consciousness model. We don't have to do that, but it can help us to be aware of what people may be expecting of us. Second, think about what it means to perform femininity in your role, your ministry setting, your region. Is what seems to be expected of you aligned with who you are? Being aware of these outside pressures can help you be more aligned in your leadership styles and then claim who you are in leadership. And third, consider the power of physical presence. What does it mean to take up space as a leader? Peace Bang is the blogging name of a Unitarian Universalist pastor, and she writes for a blog called Beauty Tips for Ministers. It's tongue-in-cheek, but it's excellent because I love how she talks about how a theater background should be required for all clergy in terms of presentation, dress, physical presence, and movement. We don't have to fit into a particular model of leadership presentation, but it is helpful to be aware of how you want to take up space in a room. And for men, first, have the awareness that there may be challenges with gender, power, imbalance, and authority in a setting, even if you don't seem to see it yourself. Code switching is a fantastic skill for all of us, and sometimes those of us who may be managing a situation may be so smooth that you might not notice what's actually going on. And second, don't expect conversations around gender and power to always be nice or comfortable. Conversations around gender and race are really an extension of conversation around women and our discomfort around women, roles, power, and authority. And that quote comes directly from Mandy McDowell, by the way. So I call you and I call myself to continue to think about what it means to flourish in ministry as women and men, lay and clergy leaders. What does it mean for us to hold each other accountable for our leadership structures and our individual leadership styles so that all may be heard and we may accurately reflect the kingdom of God? Thank you.